A fáilte romh go léir. Welcome to Carlow College, St. Patrick's. My name is Thomas McGrath, and on behalf of Carlow College, it is my pleasure to introduce today's public lecture, which is being given on English poetry with a particular reference to the Leaving Certificate curriculum. Our lecturer today is Dr. Simon Workman, Programme Director of the BA Honours in English and History and lecturer in English here in Carlow College. The title of his lecture is Reading the Poetry of Emily Dickinson and the Unseen Poem. What is poetry and how do we understand it? As well as directing the BA Honours in English and History, Dr. Workman also lectures on the BA and BA Honours in Arts and Humanities, which has the discipline of English within it. We are very pleased that so many of you, over 1,000, have again joined us today for this live-streamed lecture. Normally, we would have our Carlow schools in this hall, but with the current strength of the pandemic, that isn't possible. We are delighted to be joined, though, by schools not just from here in Carlow and surrounding counties, but from all over Ireland and by people in various parts of the world. Dr. Workman will speak for about 45 minutes, allowing 15 minutes for questions at the end. I will put questions from the floor to Dr. Workman at the end of his lecture. So now, it is over to Dr. Simon Workman for today's lecture from Carlow College.
Thank you very much, Tom. No, I'll just get on. Okay. So folks, today, you can probably tell from my subtitle that the themes I'm talking about are pretty large. What is poetry and how we understand it? We could speak for a whole term about these subjects, okay? So I'm going to start with some pretty simple questions, and hopefully those simple questions will bring us to an understanding of how poetry works and what you might be thinking about when you sit down to read a poem, okay? So, okay, great, it's working. So I'm going to start with some simple questions. The first one is, where is poetry? And I'm asking these questions almost like a child might ask them, because I think sometimes it's the simplest questions that sometimes generate the most complex answers. Where is poetry? When is poetry? How is poetry? And why is poetry? Okay. The first question that I ask, where is poetry or where is the poem? Well, obviously, the poem originates with the author and their reality. But the poetic text is often confused with the poem itself. So when I say the author and their reality, what I mean by that is their personal experience, their culture, the books that they're reading, they go into what we call the poetic text. And the poetic text can mean something that you read, or something that you hear performed, or something even that's animated. And I know that Emily Dickinson's poems have had some wonderful animation in the past. But that's not the poem, that's the poetic text. The poem and where the poem happens is in the intersection between the poetic text and you, the reader or the listener, and how it ramifies upon your consciousness, how it intersects with it. And then, when you engage with it, I get this to work, you get the poem. So the poem is the intersection point between the poetic text, it's coming back now, and your imagination. So it is, in fact, a unique co-creation between text and reader. So you're implicated in the poem in a way, in a good way, with this idea, all right? It's not something that's out there, it's something that happens in here, is the point I'm trying to get across to you. That's where the poem is, okay? So for example, if a poet had written a poem and no one ever read it, can it truly said to exist as a poem, all right? So where is the poem? The poem's here, in a co-creation between text and reader or listener, okay? So when is the poem? When is the poem? When does the poem happen? Okay, I think the top of the PowerPoint is just getting cut off there, but I think you can still see the relevant material. So I'm just using a quote from Heraclitus, very famous Greek philosopher. And one of the most famous phrases or ideas he came up with is, he says, and this is the translation by a guy called Plutarch. He says, you cannot step twice in the same rivers, for other rivers flow on. And that's been sort of paraphrased as, you cannot step in the same river twice. Now, how does that apply to poems? Okay, we might think of the poem as an ever-changing river. Every time the poem is spoken or performed, and remember, poetry as a genre emerges from the oral periods. It began first as something that was spoken and remembered, but every time it is spoken and performed, it's said with a different sound, a different pitch, different accent, different timing. It's never quite the same as the previous time. Just as you can't step in the same waters of the river, you can't step into the same poem because every performance of it is different. But it could also mean that you yourself are different every time you step into the poem, because you're at a different life stage. I'd imagine that if you're reading Emily Dickinson poetry now, in 40 years' time, those poems will read differently because you are different, okay? And every time you reread it, it happens again. So when does the poem happen? The poem is reborn every time the reader or the listener hears it and co-creates it, okay? And it's something I think that if you learn a poem, or if you can learn to remember a poem or memorize a poem, it can be something that stays with you in your mind as a kind of soundtrack. And at different points and at different times, phrases from that poem will come into your head. And again, it's being reborn, it's happening again. So there's a potentially infinite number of times that the poem can happen. It doesn't just happen when it's first written, it happens when it's co-created, okay? All right. Okay, how is poetry? How does poetry happen? Okay, how does poetry happen? Well, cognitive scientists will tell you that, if I can get this to work, that different hemispheres of the brain process sounds differently, okay? The left hemisphere of the brain processes sounds for meaning. The right hemisphere of the brain, you get this to work, processes sounds for their sort of intuitive or emotional aspect, okay? And what that means, folks, in terms of poetry, is that one side of your brain is scanning words and sentences for their semantic sense, what they mean. What's the poem saying, in other words, okay? And I think the mistake that most people make, or people tend to make when they read poetry, is they say, that's what reading poetry is about. It's telling people what the poem is saying. But to my mind, that's to lose at least half of what the poem's trying to do, okay? Because the other thing that the poet is trying to do is create sense through sound and sound patterning. What we might term the verbal music of the poem, okay? And when you're asked what the poem means, half of the meaning of the poem rests with the way it sounds. Because you could simply, you could paraphrase a Shakespeare poem and say, well, it's about love. But even though that's what it's about, that's not the poem. The poem is an artifact in sound. And I think if we were to demote it just to what it said, just to what it's about, that diminishes poetry. So poetry engages both sides of the brain, should engage both sides of the brain, I think. And it's a rich synthesis of both those sides of the brain. That's why writing poetry is so difficult, because you have to maintain a sense of what am I saying? What are the analogies I'm offering, going to provide the reader? But also, how am I saying it? How am I creating a music for the reader and the listener? Okay? And when you sit down with your unseen poem, what students, I think, tend to do is they focus on the left hemisphere of the brain and what it's doing. What do the words mean? What's the syntax? What's the sentence structure? What's the symbolism? What's the imagery? What's the metaphor? What are the large abstract ideas? Those things are important. Of course they are. But the other side of the brain is also enjoying something. And if you think of something like a song, think of a song without the accompanying music and how bare it would be and how stark it would be. The same thing applies to poetry, because poetry should have, and often does have, it has that music to it, okay? Which is situated in the rhythms, the rhymes, the meter, the alliteration, the repetition of phrases and parallelism, the word sounds, onomatopoeia, and the larger sound patterns, okay? So when you sit down with the poem that you haven't seen before, don't ignore the right hemisphere of the brain either, okay? Now, there isn't time in 45 minutes to talk you through every single poetic device that exists out there. So I want to focus on one device, the use of metaphor, okay? Because I think that's something that's often misunderstood or only partially understood, okay? So the Oxford Handbook of Literary Terms describes metaphor as a figure in which one thing or idea or action is referred to by a word or expression, denoting another thing, idea, or action, so as to suggest some common quality shared between the two. Basically, folks, it's a use of language in which one thing is expressed in terms of another. So that causes us, when we read it, to compare both, okay? It works through analogy. And just to give you concrete examples of this, I want to use metaphors that you've all come across before, okay? So if you say, he is a big fish in a small pond, you're not literally saying this person is a fish and they exist in a pond. You're saying they are like a big fish in a small pond, okay? If you say love is a battlefield, you don't literally mean that the two lovers have guns pitched against them. I mean, maybe they do, but generally what people mean by that is, you know, it's figuratively a battlefield. It's like a battlefield. It feels like a battlefield. It's not really a battlefield. And there's another phrase, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That doesn't mean you're literally throwing the whole baby on the bathwater. Right? It means you know, don't destroy the whole thing just for one part of it. Okay. And then a simile, guys, is just a subspecies of metaphor where the comparison is made explicit. So you say as fit as a fiddle, or as happy as Larry is this phrase we have in Ireland. I don't know who Larry was, but he obviously was a very happy individual because he's always compared there. I don't know who the original Larry was. Or as busy as a bee. And we have these Irish expressions like stop acting the maggots. You're not saying the person is actually a maggot crawling around. You're saying they're kind of acting like that, okay? Or stall the ball. And we have a great and rich poetics for drinking in our country, which may say something about our culture. I don't want to play into stereotypes, but when you sort of look at some of the phrases that we use for drinking, you know, one is hammered or plastered or wrecked or half cut or in a bad way or mangled or battered or off his trolley. Talk about battlefields. Seems to be when you drink in this country, you're going into war and bad things happen, okay? So these are kind of common or submerged metaphors, and you see this in sort of popular music. And just to give you a couple of examples, this is Katy Perry's song, you may know, Firework. She begins that song with two fairly explicit similes. Do you ever feel like a plastic bag drifting through the wind? It's a great sort of example of maybe someone who feels lost and is drifting in life. Or do you ever feel so paper? I'm not going to sing it, unfortunately. And here's where when you lose the music, you lose poetry, because when Katy Perry's singing it, this is much better. But anyway, do you ever feel so paper thin, like a house of cards, one blow from caving in? So the fragility of ego there is expressed quite well. And then, because baby, you're a firework. You know, you're beautiful and you're bright and you, I don't know what else you want, you sparkle through the sky, right? It's kind of, it's a good metaphor, all right? Now, not all pop music is necessarily quite as good as Katy Perry. I think this is One Direction, and they have a line, presumably to your lover, and they say, I've tried playing it cool, but when I'm looking at you, I can't ever be brave because you make my heart race. Should be there, I can't quite see it. Which is the sense of, you know, like a horse racing that, you know, you're getting excited. But that's a very standard and maybe quite, you know, poor metaphor, I think there. They also have this verse, which I've wondered about. It says, shot me out of the sky, you're my kryptonite. Now, kryptonite, I don't know if you remember, is the thing that kills Superman. So presumably there's some sort of terrible thing that this lover is doing to them through kryptonite. One of my favorite of kind of recent, so not very recent, but some of you may know 50 Cent, he's a rapper. He has this really interesting simile that he employs at one point. He says, we only human, and again, I'm not rapping this, so it sounds terrible. When he does, it's much better. But we only human girl, we make mistakes. To make it up, I do whatever it take. I love you like a fat kid loves cake. Now, to me, I don't know if I'd like to be the lover in this one. I don't know because you think about what does that suggest? It suggests that, you know, it's some sort of terrible, toxic, addictive quality of this love, you know, that although he does say, you know my style, I say anything to make you smile. So maybe there's a joke there, but a fat kid loving cake, I'm not sure that's a great, I don't think that's up there with some of the Shakespearean attitudes towards love, but that's in popular, all right? So the metaphor is I think, it's a sine qua non. In other words, I don't think poetry can exist without it. It's one of the few things you say all poetry should have, because it compresses, it concentrates language, it makes you think of two things at once, at least, okay? But why do we write and why do we read poetry? What's the why poetry? Okay, there are probably, hundreds of answers to this question. I want to offer one today in this first part of the talk, and then when we get to Emily Dickinson, I want to offer you another reason. Okay, there's a very famous Russian formalist critic called Viktor Shklovsky, and he offers us a sort of definition of art which can be very readily applied to poetry. And I'm going to give you a poem which kind of humorously, I think, is an example of what he's talking about here. Okay, so Shklovsky says, art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. What he means by there, not as they are habitually known, and not as they are known in the everyday. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, to slow us down, to make us re-see our world, okay? And he uses the phrase to defamiliarize reality, okay? To see our world anew, all right? Now, to kind of give you a concrete example of that, because that might seem quite abstract, okay? I want to use an example from a group of poets called the Martian poets. And I think they exemplify what Aristotle said in his Poetics about metaphor. He said, Aristotle, one of the most, I suppose, famous and one of the first definers of what poetry is. He offers this taxonomy of poetry in his Poetics. But he makes this point about metaphor, which I think is important. He says, a good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarity in dissimilars. The similarity in dissimilars. And what he means by that is that a good metaphor shows the similar qualities between things we might not necessarily see on the surface or logically as having similarities between them. Okay, so let's look at some examples of that in the pursuit of this defamiliarization of the world with a poem called The Martian. The Martian sends a postcard home. And the Martian poets, guys, were a group of poets in the 1980s who sought to use metaphor in unusual ways. To offer us a new and sort of fascinating perspective on everyday life. And perhaps the most famous poem of this group of poets is A Martian Sends a Postcard Home. So the premise is kind of absurd. The idea is that it's a Martian has landed from Mars, a Martian has landed from Mars on Earth, and he's writing a postcard home about what it's like on Earth. And he's telling us all about it, okay, to his Martian friends, all right? That's the premise that they use to sort of offer us an idea about this. Now, the Martian knows certain things that you might not expect a Martian to know, and certain things that you would expect him to know. He knows certain details about human history that are unusual, and certain details that aren't. But the upshot, I think, is a poem that it gives you a new appreciation, perhaps, of reality itself. All right. So this is the first two stanzas. He says, caxtons are mechanical birds with many wings, and some are treasured for their markings. Now, a little bit of knowledge you might need here. William Caxton was a 15th century merchant. He's kind of known historically as the first man to bring the printing press to England. So what the Martian calls books are caxtons in this. Or sorry, what the Martian calls caxtons are books in this. So if you can replace caxton with books here, you'll see where the metaphor is going. Books are mechanical birds with many wings, and some are treasured for their markings. They cause the eyes to melt or the body to shriek with pain. So there's this lovely idea of books as things with wings, and we'll come back to that at the end of the lecture, that take us somewhere and cause the eyes to melt. Of course, we understand that to mean crying, but it's a lovely metaphor, isn't it, for crying? Or the body to shriek with pain. The poor Martian doesn't understand that's laughter, okay? So books can generate laughter and tears, okay? He says, I have never seen one fly, but sometimes they perch on the hand, okay? And you might think there, I've tried to suggest, in terms of images there, the shape of the book on the hand is also the shape of a bird in flight. What he's trying to imply here is the notion of imaginative flight with the book, okay? And then he goes on, Mist is when the sky is tired of flight and rests its soft machine on the ground. Then the world is dim and bookish, like engravings under tissue paper. That notion of the mist outside, and if you look outside today, there's clouds, but the mist as when the sort of sky settles down as a great machine. Initially, you say the sky is not a machine, it's an organic structure, it's weather. But when you think about it as this great complex machine, it makes you think about it slightly differently. All the moving parts up in the sky, okay? And he says, rain is when the earth is television. And I'm not sure the current generation, the people who are listening today, might understand what's meant by that, but when you used to switch off TVs back in the day, you used to get this kind of static. And he's comparing it to that. And notice how the Martian kind of thinks about things in terms of machinery. He's understanding our worlds in kind of a non-organic way. It has the properties of making colors darker. He says a Model T is a multi-Ford, it's a car. This is his description of a car, something you're very used to. Model T is a room with the lock inside, so you lock yourself inside. A key is turned to free the world. So think about that. What's he saying? Well, when you turn on a car, it moves and there's a sudden sense of freedom as you move through the world. A key is turned to free the world for movement so quick, there is a film to watch for anything is missed. So you think about when you're driving, you look up in your mirror, you can see what's behind you. Okay, that's what he's suggesting. And then he says, and this is again, I think, where the defamiliarization comes in, but time is tied to the wrist, or kept in a box, ticking with impatience. You know, we don't necessarily think about time in those terms. We think of time as something that flows, but he's saying these strange humans, they tie time to their wrists. They keep it ticking. They're on a sort of schedule. And it's a sort of wonderful sense of like, you know, is that the way we should necessarily live in time? Okay. And then he has this wonderful analogy, I think, that might even apply to today in terms of how we use phones. I mean, when he's talking about phones here, he's talking about old-fashioned phones, back when people had to dial and not just sort of press a button. He says, in homes, a haunted apparatus sleeps that snores when you pick it up. If the ghost cries, they carry it to their lips and soothe it to sleep with sounds. And yet they wake it up deliberately by tickling with a finger. What's strange here is he thinks of a phone almost like a baby, you know, that you carry and you pick up. But he might be saying something about how we're tied to our phones. And this probably applies more so than now than it ever did, actually, that they kind of demand our attention, that they haunt us. And yet, even though we need to soothe them and talk to them and give our attention to them, that we still wake them up and engage our attention with them, okay? And then this was the more humorous side of things. He says, only the young are allowed to suffer openly. Adults go to a punishment room with water, but nothing to eat. And I think this is one of the great analogies for toilets here. This is literally toilet humor. They lock the door and suffer the noises alone. So there's a sense of, this is the way the Martian sees toilets. People screaming, oh, you know, screaming out to try and go to the toilet. And what's interesting is that only children are allowed to suffer openly, you know, the way that we sort of are socialized out of the sounds that we make when we go to the toilet. And he says, no one is exempt from these punishment rooms and everyone's pain has a different smell, which is a kind of a nice way of thinking about it. And then he finishes. So he goes, what I love about this poem is the tonal shifts, you know, some quite abstract ideas, some sophisticated thinking, some sort of base toilet humor. Then he finishes, I think, with aplomb, with a really unusual way of describing sleeping and dreaming. He says, at night, when all the colors die, what a way to describe darkness falling. They hide in pairs. I love that idea that like we're hiding, you know, in pairs in our beds and read about themselves in color with their eyelids shut. And he's describing dreams there, okay? And it's a wonderful description of how we might conceptualize dreaming. We read about ourselves in color with our eyelids shut, okay? So what's the effect of this? All of these everyday objects, mists, cars, phones, toilets, sleep, dreams, maybe become strange and new to us. And the poem offers us a new way to understand our reality and maybe a new way to be in our reality, okay? And it maybe returns us perhaps to the wonder that we might have had when we're small, when you're not used to everything. When a toilet is fascinating, you know, when a TV is fascinating, and when the sky is fascinating, and you look at it, you really look at it, you really pay attention, and that's what the poem is trying to do, to slow your perception down, to make you feel the sensation of life again. You know, in your daily commute from day to day to school and back or to work, we don't have time to do this. We don't have time to be attentive. What Craig Rain wants you to do is to slow down, think about it anew, okay? And then things might feel newer and maybe odder and maybe more luminous, okay? So Dickinson, I think, in some ways shares a lot with the Marston School, because I think her poems are designed to produce a certain type of effect. And she offers what's one of the most, truly the most unusual definitions of poetry I've read, okay? It is not, she doesn't say anything about the actual structure of the poem or what it looks like on the page. It's all about the effect. And this was a letter she wrote to a guy called Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was her mentor, friend, a person who she first sort of tried to discuss poetry with and get published with, okay? Because he edited a magazine called The Atlantic. She says, in answer to this question about poetry, she says, if I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way? Now, I'm not sure I've ever read a poem that took my head off, you know, that this is, you can sense how much she feels poems and how much she's invested in them with this description. She also says, that's the only way I know it. It's not like that's sometimes how I know poetry. She says, this is the only way I know it, okay? So it's very much about the effect that it has on you as a reader, all right? I just want to give you a very brief synopsis of Dickinson's life, because I don't want to buy into the sort of mythos that surrounds Dickinson. And sort of confirm sort of stereotypes about her. So I'll just give you a very brief summary, which is relevant to the poems I'm going to read. She was born in a place called Amherst, Massachusetts, in the northeast of the United States in 1830s, relatively early in the 19th century. Her father was a rather austere man and had quite definite opinions about the roles of men and women in his household. He was also quite a noted politician. He took the bar. He also served in the state and national congress. So a very powerful man in many senses. And the Dickinsons were a very prominent family in the area. So they would have been subject to scrutiny in that sense. Dickinson attended, her first school was a place called Amherst Academy. And the curriculum there was actually quite forward thinking for its time. So she would have studied English, obviously, but also Latin and botany. And she was particularly interested in botany and other natural sciences. And during that time, she was actually very sociable. So we tend to think of Dickinson as this reclusive figure, but at that time she traveled from house to house and seemed to be someone who was able to engage quite comfortably with her peers, okay? But there was early signs, I think, in her life that she was also someone who was radical in her thought and independent in her thought. In 1847, she entered a place called Mount Holyoke Seminary. And the founder of that school was a woman called Mary Lyon. And she once asked the girls in the class to divide themselves into 3 different categories. I don't know if you can see it there. Those who had confessed their faith were known as professors of faith. So these are people who had accepted God, had faith in God, professors of faith. Those who seemed close to doing so were known as hopers. So these are people who maybe hadn't quite established their faith with God, but they're getting there. And then there were those at the very bottom who had little or no desire to convert, and they were the no-hopers, okay? Emily was the only one who chose to define herself as no-hoper. And she left Mount Holyoke a no-hoper. There's 2 things I think that are interesting about that. One, it's lonely, I think, and disturbing maybe to lose a worldview, a comforting worldview in God and the afterlife, right? It's particularly lonely when everyone else seems to believe that and you're the only one who doesn't, okay? And that was Emily, and she refused to kind of betray her own mind and her own self by sort of claiming herself to be a no-hoper or a hoper when she wasn't. Okay. Not long after her return from Mount Holyoke, her mother became very ill, and for the next 27 years, the maternal roles kind of shifted, and Emily and her sister cared for the mother, and that involved a lot of work, okay? In the late 1860s and 70s, she became more and more removed from the norms of her community, and secluded in her living habits, and she began to wear all white sometime around 1869. Okay, but we have this remarkable moment in Dickinson's life. After her mother passed, after her father passed, and particularly after the death of her nephew Gilbert, who she was very close to, she begins to become more reclusive, both emotionally and physically. Okay, and that's the sort of version of Dickinson we tend to know, that the woman who's, you know, within her room. Okay, she eventually died from a suspected stroke in 1886. The vast majority of her poems remained unpublished. And remember, we're talking about one of the great poets of the 19th century here. It's a great tragedy in some ways of her life, but she didn't know how famous she would become. There's a man in Carlow College talking about Emily Dickinson on the 21st century. You know, she's a poet of international renown, probably one of the most important poets of the 19th century, and certainly within the Western canon. But the vast majority of her poems were not published. Maybe upwards of 10 were published, and never in the form that she wanted. But what she did do, between the years 1858 and 1864, she gathered up around 800 poems and or made copies of them and gathered them into 40 groups and kind of bound them together. And these were called fascicles. And they were sort of in a trunk in a room that her sister discovered after Emily had died. Okay, and they formed the basis for future publication. And once she found an audience, it grew and grew and grew. And she is still one of the most popular poets in America today. But it's striking to me that, you know, only about 6 or 7 of those were published in her lifetime, and not to any great fame or acclaim. Okay, so I just want to address this question of her solitude. Okay, we tend to think of freedom as freedom to do things. I have the freedom to move about. I have agency to move in society, to move around society. Okay, I think there's also freedom from certain things. Okay, Dickinson's choice to confine herself may in part have been the only lifestyle that she could countenance, given the other options that were available to her as a 19th century woman, okay, in America. Because to choose to go out into the public sphere, into the world, would have probably meant marriage or maternity, or even life as an author of more sentimental fiction, the type of poetry that women were expected to write. Her solitude may have been the only way, I think, that she could have been truly free and truly authentic to herself. So in this time of lockdown and crisis, when you're shut into the house, for Dickinson, that actually might have been a step into freedom, so that she didn't have to do certain other things that would have taken away her time from what she truly wanted to do, I think, which was write poetry and read poetry. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 poems very quickly here today, and 2 of them at least engage with the notion of nature. Okay, when Dickinson is dealing with nature, she often deals with it in a very precise and often intense detail. Okay, sometimes she frames nature as a nurturing feminine influence. Okay, sometimes the natural world is cast in a more sinister light. The 2 poems we're going to look at in that regard, A Bird Came Down the Walk and There's a Certain Scent of Light, they portray a slightly more disturbing and complex view of nature. Okay, so the first one I'll just read it to you, and then I'll sort of offer you some analysis. A bird came down the walk, he did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass, and then hopped sideways to the wall to let a beetle pass. He glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all abroad. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head, like one in danger, cautious. I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers and rowed him softer home. Then oars divide the ocean, 2 silver for a seam, or butterflies off banks of noon leap plashless as they swim. Okay. First thing to say about this, guys, it's an almost archetypally Dickinsonian poem. One of Dickinson's great critics, Helen Vander, says what is typically Dickinsonian about this poem is her cool eye, her unsparing factuality, her startling similes and metaphors, her psychological observation of herself and others, her capacity for showing herself mistaken, and her exquisite relish of natural beauty. So let's talk about what Vander is talking about there, okay? First thing to say, guys, the poem is in 5 stanzas, which are quatrains. They're 4-line verses or stanzas, and it has a fairly regular iambic meter. Okay, so the beat falls on the even number of the syllables. The speaker sort of sits back and watches a bird come down the walk, and we can imagine Emily here in her back garden here looking at this bird. And initially, the bird is not conscious of Dickinson. It doesn't know that I saw, so it's being observed, but doesn't realize it's being observed. But then the bird does something very unpoetic and not idealistic. It eats this angleworm raw. So it's quite vicious. It sort of chomps down in this poor little angleworm and scoffs it into its mouth. And then there's a sort of switch again where the bird almost is quite genteel in what it's doing. He drank a dew. So the dew is the dew, the sort of water that rests on the grass after a moist night. He sort of pecks at that dew, sucks it up from a convenient grass. So he has a nice little drink of dew from water. And then he sort of hops sideways to let a beetle pass. Rather gentlemanly, okay? Politely, all right? Does all those things. So there's kind of already a contradiction here in this personified bird. One moment he's sort of brutally eating up this poor little worm. The next minute he's sort of standing aside, for the beetle to pass, okay? We might begin to see that this is not just a poem about nature. It's a poem about how we perceive the natural world and the mistakes that humans make in trying to attribute our qualities and sensibilities to it and the reality of the natural world itself. Then we're told he glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all abroad, all around. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head. In this moment, the bird becomes more conscious of being observed and looks all around. It's frightened. Notice the frightened beads of his eyes. Beady eyes make us think perhaps of something that's not within our ken, that we don't understand, it's beyond human perception. And I think at this point, Dickinson perhaps feels distant from the bird, okay? But then she tries to coax it towards him. So she says, like one in danger, cautious. So what's odd now is the bird has been frightened. Now she is the one that's frightened, and she's trying to kind of cautiously offer the bird a crumb to coax it towards her. I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers and rode him softer home. So in the final kind of lines of the poem, we see these 3 metaphors build as the bird flies away. So first of all, the bird unrolls his feathers, like a piece of parchment perhaps, and you can imagine a bird kind of stretching out his wings, and rode him softer home. Than oars divide the ocean to silver for a seam. This is maybe a slightly complex metaphor, but what she's saying is if you can imagine someone rowing a boat, okay? Rowing a boat, and if you can imagine a bird flapping backwards up into the sky, it's an oar who's so skillful that there's no splash when the oar enters the water. The bird sort of cuts the air so cleanly, is how she describes it, and flies out into the air, which is his own medium, okay? But she's not satisfied with that metaphor, so she goes for one more description, one more analogy. She says, or butterflies off banks of moon leap plashless as they swim. So as the bird rises up, she kind of achieves this new and final metaphor. She describes the bird as swimming soundlessly into the air, like butterflies who sort of jump off the banks of a river into the air without sound, but beautiful, and plashless as they swim into the air. So there's a confusion here between air and water. Plashless just means splashless. So the birds kind of swim into the air softly and soundlessly, like the bird, okay? That's the suggestion at that, all right? And it's if you think about the arc of the poem, we end with this beautiful image of the bird taking flight up into the air, all right? Now, this is a sort of intriguing little narrative, all right, in which first the speaker watches a bird devour the angleworm and then majestically take flight. What's interesting to me about this poem, and one of the things that's interesting to me, is that there is this remarkable dialectic between nature as savage, and that dialectic, I mean contradiction or synthesis, between nature as savage, brutal, and even mysteriously sinister, and nature as beautiful, an inspirational source, much more romantic notion of nature, okay? There's also a further reading to it that certain critics have applied, that it's actually an allegory of love, okay? That she's using the bird to describe her fortunes in love. So she sort of cautiously offers the crumb of herself to her lover. What does her lover do? He takes flight, okay? And what's ironically more beautiful than a lover who doesn't want you? For some reason, when someone rejects you, they become more mysterious or beautiful in your eyes. And that seems to be what happens in this poem, okay? All right, so that's, all right, so second poem we'll look back at is There's a Certain Slant of Light, which is the perfect poem to be doing today, because it seems to describe the very nature of today. It's a winter afternoon. But just before we look at that, guys, I just want to draw your attention to the way that Dickinson uses form in this poem. So one of the things that Dickinson would have been immersed in within her own life is the hymn form itself, okay? So hymns, guys, you may have gone to church, you might have sang some hymns in your time. Dickinson would have been, from a very young age, not just immersed in listening to hymns at church, but also reading hymns. She had a book, we know that this was in her library, a book by a guy called Isaac Watts, who was a very famous 19th century composer of hymns. It was called Watts' Christian Sanity, okay? And in that book, it actually tells you how to write hymns and teaches you the meter for them and the rhyme for them, okay? So just to sort of tell you, just very briefly, what is the hymn form? What's the kind of classic hymn form? And this is the form that Dickinson's poems kind of use and improvise from. Pretty much, I'd say 80 or 90% of them use this form as a kind of base to sort of improvise from. When we think of hymns, guys, we think of something that has quite a strict meter and has quite a strong and perhaps comforting message. So here's O God, Our Help in Ages Past, which is probably one of the most famous Isaac Watts hymns. I'm not going to sing it because I don't want to impose that upon you, but he says, O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. The rhyme scheme is A, B, meaning the first line rhymes with the third line, the second line rhymes with the fourth line. It follows a very strict meter and rhythm, and that meter and strict rhythm fits the hymn, which has a very comforting, ordered message about your life in the after and now, okay? Dickinson uses that form with all that it implies, okay? And it's one of my favorites. There's a certain slant of light. And if you look out the window now, I think that the light that's coming into us perhaps replicates this poem. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it any, 'tis the sealed despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. A very different poem to the one we've just read, a very different ending to the poem we've just read, okay? What I think is interesting about that first line is that there is a certain slant of light, specificity in that. It's not just the light that comes in winter, it's a certain time of the day, it's the arc of the light coming through my window, or as I walk into the fields. It's that specific moment of light that I find oppressive, that oppresses me. It happens on winter afternoons just like this one, okay? And she uses a kind of paradoxical phrasing here, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. We think of music as something as light and airy. We think of cathedrals as a place that might inspire us to God and to hope. She says, no, to her at least, this light is like the heft of cathedral tunes, okay? I think what she means by that is that light itself is something that's airy and light. But in the same way that the music of the cathedral for Dickinson, who didn't like going to church and found it oppressive, might oppress her, this light, which is supposed to be something that gives us hope, actually she finds oppressive, okay? And what's interesting is how she speaks to God here, I think. Heavenly hurt it gives us. So heavenly hurt, that's an oxymoron, a phrase in which two contradistinct ideas come together. Heaven is supposed to be a place of pleasure, without pain, you know? Hurt, capitalized hurt as well, notice the unusual capitalization, is something that you wouldn't expect to find in heaven. So what's she saying there? Why is it heavenly hurt? Why is it not some other form of hurt? Well, perhaps it's from God himself, or it's the pain that I suffer under a Christian worldview or a Calvinist worldview that her father would have preached. But she says, heavenly hurt it gives us. So there is this pain she feels, but she says, we can find no scar. There is no obvious bodily manifestation of this pain. Where is the pain then? Okay, she says, we can find no scar but internal difference where the meanings are. Okay, so it's an internal pain. It's an internal difference. It's some form of conflict in her life. Maybe it's a conflict with God, maybe it's a conflict with herself. Okay, but it's internal difference where the meanings are. What creates meaning, what generates meaning? Consciousness, the mind. Okay, but what a wonderfully concise explanation of mental suffering and mental health issues. Okay, we can find no scar but internal difference where the meanings are. Okay, none may teach it any. 'Tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction, sentence of the air. This type of suffering can't be taught. It has to be lived to be truly understood. It's a form of despair. When she uses the word there, 'tis the seal despair, she's actually, there's a biblical allusion to Revelations there on the end of days. But I think we can also think of it as something you've been stamped with. You've been sealed with this despair. An imperial affliction, sentence of the air. So again, who is the emperor here? It seems to me like it might be God. Okay. When it comes, the landscape listens. Shadows hold their breath. So she personifies the shadows here in this poem. And we might think of, why are the shadows holding their breath? Because as the light, that slant of light goes down, it's what the shadows need to survive. They need light. And as it goes down, they will too fall into complete darkness. So there's a sense, that irony of the shadows require light for their very being. They hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. Okay, so it's as though I think, when I think of this poem, I think of the speaker as someone, the light is sort of stimulating them in a way that is painful to them. But without that light, she falls into a kind of numbness. Okay, and that numbness, she says, is like the distance on the look of death. Okay, everything falls into a kind of a visual unreachability here. And it's almost like the way you might look on a corpse, the distance that you feel from that person at that time. But there's no sort of answer to that gaze, okay? And that's what I think she means by distance here, on the look of death. And she may very well feel like that in the darkness as the light goes down. She may feel distanced from everything, okay? So it's one of Dickinson's most dark and disturbing poems, but yet, and I think this is important, these poems are still productive, because I think all of us perhaps have felt like this, certainly in recent times, and when I stare out the window while I'm locked down, looked at the light and thought, this is so oppressive. The fact that someone has been able to articulate it for us, and the fact that someone else has felt this, might make us feel a little bit less lonely. Okay. So I just want to reference its use of the hymn form. Okay. All those disturbing ambiguities and references to God, that's a far cry for what you'd expect to get in a hymn by Isaac Watts, okay? And the very fact that her version of the hymn form, which is not as precise as Watts's, that doesn't have the precise rhyme scheme or meter, but yet has the ghost of it in it, is Dickinson's way of being in conversation, I think, with the type of God that Isaac Watts was sort of suggesting, all right? So we've noticed in the previous poem that nature could provoke moments of bliss. Here, nature and the natural light provokes moments of deep mental suffering, okay? And it is a poem in which Dickinson perhaps expresses a moment of no faith or lack of faith or skepticism about God, all right? But I want to finish with perhaps the poem that is most famous. And after all that sort of darkness, we might remember that Dickinson was also a poet of hope. And I would say, guys, in terms of Dickinson, if you're trying to think about her as a poet, and what's her worldview, what's her perception of reality, I would quote another poet from the same period, Walt Whitman. He says, do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. In other words, the self is something that's complex and contradictory. We feel one way one day, we feel the other way another day, and you don't necessarily need to have consistency between the poems. Dickinson was exploring the mind, exploring all its different territories. So I think that just because in one poem she's feeling dark and depressed, in the other she's feeling massive hope, that's not inauthentic. She's just being authentic to the moment she's in. This is the poem I think most people kind of know about, if they know about Dickinson perhaps. She says, hope is the thing with feathers. Notice she says the thing with feathers, not a bird yet. It's something that allows flight. Okay, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and to perch, guys, is to kind of sit steadfast in something. All right, so this is hope. This abstract idea of hope is personified as a bird, the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words. So hope is something that can't necessarily be translated into language. It gives you inspiration, but not necessarily in a logical manner. It's something that's felt rather than understood, if that makes any sense. Okay, like music. Sometimes we can hear music and we understand what the emotion is, but we don't necessarily understand what the lyrics mean. It's a song. Hope sings the tune without the words. Okay, that you feel it, you don't necessarily understand it, and never stops at all. So it's persistent. And notice the nice, solid, full rhyme: soul and all, storm warm, sea and me, an extremity there. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm. So hope is most needed in times of storm, right? In fact, some people say hope only really exists when there's no premise for hope, because hope is an act of faith, that something will get better. And she says hope is most needed, the sweetest in the gale, okay? And sore must be the storm that could have bashed the little bird that kept so many warm, okay? That even the most terrible events can't dislodge it from the soul, according to Dickinson, okay? And she says, and notice how she goes from the general to the specific here. I've heard it in the chillest land. And the coldness and chill in Dickinson often is a sign of depression or suffering. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, okay? So when you feel, when reality feels odd to you, when reality feels something else, and you don't feel part of the world, and you feel isolated, this is where she's heard hope. Yet never in extremity it asks to come of me. The incredible thing about hope as an idea is that it doesn't cost anything. It doesn't ask anything of you. It simply exists, okay? So what Dickinson offers us then, guys, even in those three poems, you might have seen it, is a poetry which on one level seems to defy order and regularity and conventionality. It engenders a sense of the disjointedness, of the fracture, and the perplexing complexity of life, okay? But life is often contradictory and disjunctive, and her poetry attempts to recreate the unknowable and often unpredictable currents and turns of life. Part of her project in her poems, in those 1,800 poems, is to represent life's disorder to us, not just in terms of image and theme, but also visually, linguistically, and orally, all right? And to finish, okay, 2 minutes now to finish, we might ask, what was her why for poetry? Why poetry for Emily Dickinson? Why did she write poetry, okay? We've talked about the effect she thinks poetry has, but let's just finish with an idea that she presents us in a poem. I know it's not on the Leaving Cert, but I think it's worth looking at. There is no frigate like a book. And it speaks back to the poem I think we looked at the start, where she says there's no frigate. A frigate is a ship. There's no ship like a book to take us lands away, nor any coursers like a page of prancing poetry. She's referring there to horses and the prancing of poetry and the notion of traveling by horse to somewhere. So there's a ship can take us somewhere else, a horse can take us somewhere else. This traverse may the poorest take without oppress or toll. How frugal is the chariot that bears the human soul. In other words, poetry, literature, art grants us the right to travel somewhere. It doesn't cost much, okay? Because it takes the human soul somewhere, okay? And it's a lovely idea about how she felt about poetry, okay? So if we think that poetry should be understood, I think, as a journey. And she famously stated that the mind is wider than the sky, indicating, I think, the immense scale and vastness of consciousness itself. We tend to think of vastness as existing outside. Dickinson says, think about what you can do with your interior mind, okay? I think writing poetry was perhaps for Dickinson one means of navigating staggering, near boundless landscapes of the human psyche, okay? And while other 19th century poets were visiting, like Walt Whitman, who I referenced earlier, they were discovering and depicting these sort of immense and rapidly transforming spaces of the American continent. Dickinson was mastering the art of interior exploration. She hiked the valleys and cliffs and riverbeds of the mind and returned to tell how it is. Okay, I'll finish with this. She once wrote to her brother in 1871, "Life is a spell so exquisite that everything conspires to break it." I think poetry may have been one of the ways that Dickinson sought to hold her connection to the improbable, heartbreaking, exquisite miracle that we call life. Unfortunately, she bequeathed 1,800 poems to us so that we could journey to with her. Okay, and in that sense, folks, you might say poetry is also the thing with feathers. Okay, not just hope, but poetry. And entering into a Dickinson poem, if you get it right, and if you like it, you take wing, and with your speaker as your guide, you can swoop, plunge, soar into realities that you hadn't imagined before. Horrific sometimes, ecstatic sometimes, disturbing sometimes, enchanted sometimes, and all the poem asks for is your attention. Okay, we'll finish there. Thank you. Thanks.
I think we're almost out of time, so rather than take questions, I will conclude and say thank you very much to Dr. Workman for that great and very enjoyable lecture. And I'm sure that you will join around the country with us in a virtual round of applause for a fascinating lecture delivered in Dr. Workman's own inimitable style. There is an Irish connection, a Tipperary connection, which I think we should make to Emily Dickinson, and that was that a servant in the house for several decades was Margaret Marr from Killusty, near Feathered in County Tipperary. And those poems that Dr. Workman mentioned were kept in Margaret Marr's trunk. And there is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that Emily told Margaret to burn the poems after her death. Perhaps apocryphal, but we're glad that didn't happen, whether apocryphal or not. So thank you all for joining us today on this live stream and here in person. Do email us and we'll be happy to follow up with you on any aspect of this. Our next lectures in this series will be in history, and they will be on Ireland 1916 to 1921, to be delivered by Dr. Elaine Calnan, on Europe at the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, to be delivered by Dr. Ida Millen, and on Nazi concentration and death camps, to be delivered by myself. And you can find out the details by following us on our social media and our website. And if you're not familiar with us, do check us out on the Carlow College website. Thanks today to Nerly Duffy and Orla Nicantilla, Maidon O'Fuelon, for providing the technology. So that concludes this meeting. Thank you for joining us for Dr. Simon Workman's lecture today from Carlow College. Slán a Gaibh, go léir.